to talk about rights this morning. I indicated that I was going to connect my two talks, and I'll explain a little bit about how I intend to do that. Equality of authority was sort of the conclusion of that talk, and I was making a case that equality of authority is a norm of equality that is worth our allegiance. It's worth valuing, it's worth seeing as important, it's reason-giving, allowing it to shape our ideas, shape policy, and so forth. Here I'm going to put it to theoretical use. And what I want to do is try to connect it with the idea of rights in a way that hopefully sheds some light on the notion of rights. So I'll explain what I mean as we go forward. But here too, I think maybe even more so than in the case of equality, where people, because of the heat surrounding the issue, might be inclined to say they don't believe in equality. Just about everybody believes in rights. Obviously, we disagree about what specific rights we have. But there are very few people who don't think the possession of rights, the notion of rights are important issues, and very few that won't appeal to rights in defending policy, prescriptions, and ideas that they favor. So just asserting that I have a right of some sort, while you assert that you have a right of a different sort, doesn't get us very far. The challenge is to try to push the conversation beyond that logger's heads. I'm going to suggest that the cases for some rights are better than others. And the way I'm going to do that is by appeal to equality of authority to let you know where I'm headed. The way I'm going to do it is by starting by thinking about what rights are and about why they matter to us, what sort of things they reveal to us. And equality of authority is going to be the main tool that I use to do that. Now, what am I not doing? Talk about rights, people's interest in it has a number of different dimensions, and some of those I'm just going to ignore. If you like, I'm happy to talk about some of this in Q&A, although necessarily what I say will be limited, but I'm more than happy to have this stuff brought up. This is one of the major areas in conjunction with thinking about what rights we have. People have very strong, sometimes deep views that they're committed to about how it is that we come to have rights in the first place. And lots of people think, and I think for plausible reasons, that it might be if we know where rights come from, that will help us sort out legitimate claims to rights versus ones that maybe are not so weak. There's lots of different theories. That's a sort of ongoing spirited debate in its own right. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to talk about sources of rights today. I'm going to be talking about the structure of the rights themselves. So what I'm after is an analysis of the nature of rights, what they mean for our relations and our interactions. That hopefully, if all goes well, things fall jelly side up, will help us get an analytical tool to sort of parse or evaluate those claims to rights that we and others are likely to make. There's a couple of other ways of thinking about, that one thing I'm not doing is thinking about sources of rights. Two other things that I'm not doing are thinking about rights in ways that are common in moral and political philosophy. More or less common depending on your starting point. So one contrast is to think about rights as a matter of entitlements that people have sort of in isolation. And what I'm thinking of here is a way of thinking about rights as a matter of some kind of connection between you and the stuff you have rights to, right? So is this your camera? So one way to think on this model, right, the idea is there's some kind of connection going on between Meg and that camera that makes that camera hers, right? And that's the story about rights that Meg has in it. In this way of thinking about rights, actually, I'm not sure where all of its roots are, but one common source of this is Marx. Marx tends to treat rights discussions as though, and he thinks they're kind of crazy for that reason, think about them as connections between individuals and the stuff that they have rights to. So in this kind of approach, right, it makes sense to say, Robinson Crusoe has rights to his treehouse. Did you guys see Castaway? Tom Hanks' character in Castaway has a right to Wilson, his volleyball. All that makes perfect sense. Meg has rights to her camera, and she could have that even if somehow she was washed up on a desert island by herself. So that's because the rights in question are connections between people and the stuff that they have rights to. I'm not going to do that. I think that's a really bad and misleading model of what rights are. And the way I'm going to approach it is actually much more common now. Not very many people, because Marx has really dissipated in force in the philosophical community, however much he thrives in sociology and English departments. In philosophy, it's a pretty minor position. And one reason for that, I think, is that it has us really thinking silly thoughts when it comes to rights. And instead, the conversation mostly takes it for granted that rights are matters of relations, not between people and stuff, between people and people. And that's the model that I'm going to have. When we're talking about rights, we're talking about relations between us. We're not talking about relations between us and cameras or volleyballs or tree houses or anything else. Obviously, those enter into it. At the end of the day, we want to be able to say something about what that camera is doing in such a way that it can be Meg's right to have property in it. But we're going to get there by focusing on what goes on between us and not between us and cameras. Here's a second way, and now we're getting to more of a deep methodological difference with a lot of work that's done in political philosophy. I'm going to contrast what I'm going to do with what I'm going to call top-down theories of rights. So what do I mean by top-down theory of rights? A top-down theory of rights works this way. It arrives at conclusions about what rights we have by starting with claims about what a rightful society is or would be. How ought stuff, and in particular, how ought stuff to be divided among us if we're going to have a just, legitimate society? And suppose I have a theory that specifies how stuff should be divided up. It might well be then that from that theory, we can come up with a theory about what rights people have. So that's very abstract. If you think about, say, a view on which a just society is one in which everyone has equal material wealth, that might help to settle questions about rights. People that were claiming rights that enable them to have more than an equal amount of stuff would obviously have a problem with those claims. Right? If your theory says people can only justly own only as much as everybody else has, now if I say, yeah, but wait, I've got rights to that plus an extra amount, you know my claim is bogus. My theory has said there is no legitimacy, there is no justice, there can't be any rights to more than an equal amount. So if you had a theory of just distributions that said everybody had exactly the same amount, that might help with some claims to rights. It might be that some understandings of rights would fall out of it. More seriously, I think of somebody, how many of you guys know the work of John Rawls? Or familiar with Rawls? Some of you, not all of you. Rawls's moral theorizing is like this. Rawls argues that we have to start with thinking about what a just society would be, which is actually a society in which the life prospects for each individual are more or less as equal as we can make them. That's a gross approximation. But from that then, that limits the kinds of claims that people can make, the kinds of claims to stuff. So we start out with an idea of a just society, and from that sort of top level macro theory, we work down to sorting out what rights people have. I'm not adopting that method either. I want to do things the other way around. I want to work bottom up. I want to think about what rights we have by thinking about the relations between us as individuals first. The way that I am proceeding here, I think, is more faithful to the classical liberal tradition. That is, we start out by thinking about the relations we have between ourselves as moral agents, and actually that operates as a constraint on our theories about what kinds of just, legal, political institutions, what those can look like, what they can be, what they can require of us. They're limited by the kinds of things they can demand of our relations with one another as individual moral agents. So in this way, the approach that I'm going to take here is bottom up instead of top down. That difference may not matter for those of you that are not interested in political philosophy or political theory. It's a heterodox way to go at this point. Most of the work that's done in political philosophy has the sort of top-down approach these days. Okay, so here's how I'm going to proceed. First, to explore the nature of rights. That is the nature of the concept, of the things that our concepts of rights are about. To fix the idea of what it means to have a right. And then second, try to use that to arrive at a story about what rights we may be entitled to. Okay, before I do that, I'm going to go a little bit wonky here. This is only 3 slides, so you can, if you want to doze off for a few minutes, this is a good point. Come back with me in about 4 slides. I think this is worth doing. I haven't actually gone through this. I've given this talk a number of times before, and I haven't gone through this, but the more time goes by, at least in my thinking of rights, I find this taxonomy so helpful that in fact I can't think about rights without it. And because not a lot of people who haven't studied rights are aware of it, I think that's a real impediment to being able to think constructively about rights. So I'm going to give you this framework. It's a fairly simple taxonomy, because it can be really useful. I'm not sure how useful it is until you've lived with it and maybe worked with it for a while. So this is something of an experiment, but I'm going to put it in here and I'm going to draw on it from time to time and what goes on otherwise. So here, John has been, Professor Hasnes has been dipping liberally into philosophy and talking about the law. Here, I'm venturing into law to talk about philosophy. Wesley Hofeld is a legal theorist back in the early part of the 20th century. Came up with this analysis of rights concepts in the law that has basically been deeply inhaled by philosophers, by legal theorists, by philosophers. It's almost ubiquitous in critical analytic discussions of rights in both the legal literature, as best I can tell, certainly in the philosophical literature. So here's Hofeld's idea. Hofeld says that when we talk about rights, or when rights show up in the law, the ideas at stake really fall into 4 kinds. It's not, rights are not one thing. Rights are 4 things. One of the things that rights are what he calls claims or claim rights. I'll be talking a little bit more about each of these in just a moment. Claim rights may be the sort of most familiar form of rights that we are ordinarily used to thinking about. Though the interesting thing about this framework, I think, is that every one of these is common in ordinary, everyday thinking about rights. So this is not some kind of space age legal theorizing for law geeks or something like that. Second are liberties. Third are what he calls powers. And the last are what he calls immunities. So all of these are rights. They're rights that do different work, or that denote different ways in which we're seeing each other, or regarding each other, or treating each other. And they work in different ways. Typically, they work together. Ordinarily, when we talk about a right to something like Meg's right to the camera, we probably mean some conjunction of these. So they sort of, rights travel in packs. They travel together in different ways. Let me see if I can explain that. So claims are the most familiar form of right. What is a claim or a claim right? A claim right amounts to a demand, or the standing to demand of others that they do or not do something. So a claim right is a demand. So when we talk about Meg's right, sorry Meg, you have to be sitting in the front row, so now you're stuck being an example here. When we talk about Meg's right to her camera, or saying that she has a property right in that camera, one thing we're going to be saying multiple things. One thing that we're saying is that she has the standing to demand of other people certain things. In particular, she has the standing to demand that we not make use of that camera without her permission. Right? We wrong her if we decide to borrow her camera for our own purposes without consulting her. Why is that? It's because it's hers. So that's maybe the sort of most intuitively, frequently thought of dimension of rights, is this standing to demand that other people not mess, in the case of a property right, not mess with your stuff. Sound plausible? Okay. So having the claim right to property means having the standing to demand that others leave it alone. And that means the standing to demand that others recognize an obligation that they have to you to leave it alone. When Meg says, get your hands off my camera, she might or might not be threatening force against us. But to the extent that she's expressing a claim right to it, she's saying we owe it to her not to do that. We have an obligation to her not to mess around with her camera. So that's what her claim right consists in. It's her having the standing to demand. It's us being obligated to respect that standing. And that's a claim right. So far so good? Is everybody on board with claim rights? It's going to get a little less intuitive after this, so I hope that one's okay. Second one's a liberty. What's a liberty? A liberty is an absence of an obligation. This is the sense in which you're the first person in this room this morning to walk in. You have a right to take any seat that you like. What does it mean to say that you have a right? It doesn't mean that you have the standing to demand anything of anybody else. What it means is nobody else has any standing to demand of you that you not. So you have a liberty right to take any seat you like. I mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
So it's an absence of obligation.
It's an absence of obligation. So to go back, I said earlier that rights travel in packs. Meg owns that camera. She has a property right in that camera. First thing is, that means she has a standing to demand that we leave it alone. The second is, she may use it without asking permission from any of us. Right now, she can't hit us with it. There's limits on that liberty that she has. But she doesn't have to ask our permission to use it. We have to ask her. She does not have to ask us. We are under an obligation. She is under no obligation to forbear from using that camera in general for the purposes for which she wants to put it. So her right in that camera means she's got a claim right. She also has a liberty right. And liberty rights are really common, and I mean, it's easy to have them go under the radar thinking that all rights are claims. One of the things I think intuitively we mean about rights to free speech, by way of example, it's easy if we're stuck in thinking about claim rights to think, well, my right to free speech has got to be something about my demand that you do something. Well, it might be. I'm not saying a right to free speech doesn't involve claims, but it essentially involves a liberty. My right to free speech means I owe it to nobody not to speak my mind. I owe it to nobody not to write what I want to write. Nobody has the standing to demand that I write or not speak something that I want to do. Yeah?
So can we think of liberty rights as a negative right?
No. Well, you could. And often they are. I think that's worrisome. I'll be talking about negative rights in a little bit. In general, I think it's worth keeping. Sometimes negative rights are spoken of as liberty rights. So some of that's just terminological. Some of it underlies a deeper way of wanting to identify categories of rights. I myself am not happy about that. We can come back to that if you like, but I'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. Okay, the third categories. These are a little bit trickier. Powers and immunities reflect our standing to change claims, obligations, and liberties. These are rights to change rights. So let me try to get this going intuitively. One of the things that we're saying when we say Meg, that's Meg's camera, that she has a property right in it, is that Meg can do stuff with that camera if she likes. That, again, not unlimited, it's bounded in various ways, but Nick, is that right? Yeah. So one thing that she can do is she can offer to sell that camera to Nick, or she can sell that camera to Nick. What does she do when she does this? She says, Nick, I no longer want the camera. I know you really like it. For 20 bucks, you can have this camera. Nick says, deal. That's a really good camera for 20 bucks. He buys it. She sells it. What has Meg done? One thing she's done is she's changed all of our obligations. Before she sells it, if we want to use the camera, who are we obligated to ask to use it? We have to ask Meg, right? What has she just done by selling it to Nick? She's changed her obligations. She now no longer owns it. We no longer have an obligation to Meg to ask her anything about the camera. Why? Because it's not hers, it's Nick's. Now our obligation is to ask Nick about using the camera, right? Before, Nick did not have the liberty to make use of that camera. Why? It was Meg's. When she sells it to him, she gives away her liberty to use the camera, because now she, like the rest of us, has to ask Nick to use it. Nick gets a liberty. He had no liberty before, now he has it. So one thing that we are saying, all of those movements in people's obligations and liberties and so forth, all of those are functions of the powers that Meg has as an owner of that camera. She can, in many cases, not unilaterally, right? This has to be a bilateral deal with Nick to have the sale. But she can change our obligations. And notice that you and I really don't have anything to say about that. We may like it. We may like asking Meg to use the camera more than we like asking Nick for one reason or another. Makes no difference. That is out of our control. Meg does not have to consult us before transferring the camera to Nick. Why? Because she has that power. So that power is also part of the rights that Meg has. So those are powers. So you have a power when you can change others' rights and obligations. Immunities sort of are to powers what liberties are to claim rights. Immunities are standing such that others can't move your obligations around on you. I can't think of a good example of immunities. I'm not sure. They're probably, I would bet my bottom dollar that somebody who's used to thinking within this framework more than I could identify immunities that are involved in the packet of rights, the bundle of rights that go along with Megan's ownership rights in her camera. I can't come up with them. But the basic idea of immunity is clear enough. We get the idea of immunity if we think about inalienable rights. Right? The Declaration of Independence, the idea is that God gives to us certain inalienable rights. What does it mean to say that they're inalienable? It means nobody can take them away. That means nobody has a power to change those rights that we have, liberties or claims or powers or whatever they are. Nobody can change them. And if nobody can change them, that means we're immune. In that particular respect, we have an immunity. So that's the fourth category of rights. Okay, that's enough with my digression. It will be helpful to come back to some of those at various points, and we will, but it's a great framework for keeping track of rights anyway. So now you have it. If you understood what I was saying, if I was sufficiently clear. If not, we can talk some more about it in Q&A. Okay. Second point here, sort of analytically, rights are conceptually tied to obligations. The idea of a right is at least partly constituted by thinking about the obligations that others have in virtue of someone having that right. The obligations that we all have to Meg, not to make use of her camera without her permission. And you'll notice how often, in just explicating that Hofeldian framework, I made reference to obligations. So thinking about rights and thinking about obligations are two sides of the same coin. Philosophers and legal theorists call this feature the correlativity of rights and obligations. Not everybody accepts it, but I think most of those who work on these things do. What's the point of this? The point of this is, if you accept this point, is that when we are thinking about rights, we are at the same time thinking about obligations. That's going to be really important for my argument as I proceed. So here's an example of a claim right, the right not to be battered, which John was talking about earlier. What it means that you have a claim right not to be battered is to say that others, each and every other person in fact, under normal conditions, has an obligation not to batter you. Right? Your right consists in their obligation. It's not just that you can stop them, but that they must not do it, that they wrong you if they batter you. Right? It's the wronging part of this relationship that captures this moral connection between rights and obligations. So what kinds of obligations are we thinking of? Well, depends here. As I mentioned, Hofeld is a legal theorist, and the language of rights is something that matters both in law and in moral philosophy. So we can be thinking about moral obligations, or we can be thinking about legal obligations, or we can be thinking about both. And these do not necessarily travel together, right? So, at least on my view, I think most views, you have a moral obligation not to lie. But in general, that the law does not require that you don't lie. There are cases in which the law does require that you don't lie. Right? The law requires that you don't lie when you get up to give testimony in a court of law. You have to swear that you're going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But precisely the fact that the rest of the time the law doesn't care whether you lie or not is reflected in the fact that you have to give that oath. Again, there are other, you can't commit fraud, there are constraints there, but if you tell somebody that, it's not me, sorry, it's not you, it's me, and this is one of those cases where that's a lie, the law doesn't really care, right? That's a way that we lie to each other. There's lots of ways that we lie to each other. Might be morally contemptible, but the law doesn't mind. So their morality objects to something that the law will let pass. Sometimes the law objects to things that morally there's no problem. As of right now, I've been doing this talk for a while too, and I'm thinking someday before too long I'm going to have to change this slide because this will no longer be true. That would be a great day. As of today, you have a legal obligation not to import cannabis into the U.S. But, at least on my view, you have no moral obligation whatsoever not to. So this is a case where the law speaks to something that morality is silent about. So the idea of rights and obligations can pull apart between morality and legality. And sometimes they speak with a single voice. Right? If it comes to stabbing your best friend, both morality and the law say you may not do that. Each and every person has both a moral right and a legal right that you not stab them. So there, legality and morality speak with one voice. Yes?
What about when you introduce context like self-defense?
Yeah, so sometimes, if you're thinking about self-defense, I think in most of these cases, like if we're thinking about self-defense, probably law and morality are going to, in general, stick together as well. It may vary, but one worry that we have sometimes about laws, especially laws that establish certain kinds of legal rights, is that they're departing too far from morality. So, for example, the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, right? There's a bunch of nonsense about the stand your ground laws, but one way of characterizing what people were worried about here was the law had deviated too much from the moral obligations that people have to yield rather than defending themselves in self-defense. So they can come apart, but pretty often I think we want them to cleave together. So this isn't settling what rights we have or whether stand your ground laws or anything else. I'm just saying that that's a case in which typically, or at least in many of those cases, they're in lockstep, as opposed to cannabis laws or laws on law. Right? They can be in any of these relations to one another. Okay, so we can talk about moral obligations, moral rights, legal obligations, and legal rights to some extent independently. But one reason that we might ascribe legal obligations is just because we think there's some kind of moral obligation. I'm inclined to think something like that is at work in cases like laws against murder and assault. John gave you a different sort of account, at least an apparently different account, talking about them as being sort of those laws emerging as devices for the solution of the resolution of conflicts. And I think that's right, but the line that I would take here is they're solutions that people see as reasonable. And part of the reason why they see them as reasonable is that they resonate with background moral judgments that people are inclined to make about those things. So I don't think we're getting disagreeing views here. I would think we're talking about two different dimensions in one phenomenon. So legal rights arise in a variety of ways through customary and statutory law. Having said that, I'm going to set aside legal rights for the rest of my talk. I'm focusing on moral rights, and it's going to be a talk about moral obligation. Okay. Switching gears now, I'm going to try to, now that I've sort of talked about what we're doing when we're talking about rights and the sort of conceptual framework behind rights, I'm going to try to move towards that tool that I was indicating earlier I was going to try to get to, which is a tool for doing some discrimination between different kinds of rights claims. And one way of distinguishing between kinds of rights, to go back to Peter's question, is to distinguish between different kinds of obligations. And here we'll distinguish between obligations to do things or obligations not to do things, or to not do certain things. So sometimes we must do things, sometimes we must not do things. And that is the basis for a distinction that's commonly made between positive and negative rights. You guys, is that terminology familiar, more or less? Language of positive and negative rights. So negative rights are rights that correspond to obligations others have not to do something or to refrain from doing something. So the right to battery is a negative right because the obligation corresponding to the right not to be battered is an obligation that others have not to batter you. Right, so look at this. All of us, right, at least everybody within sight, right at this moment, is simultaneously delivering on the obligation that we have not to batter other people. We're doing that just by having our butts planted in our seats. Right? We can simultaneously not batter everybody in the room, and in fact everybody in Charleston. We're simultaneously satisfying our obligations to everyone worldwide not to batter them at this moment. So negative rights in that sense multiply easily. Positive rights. These are rights that correspond to others, to obligations that others have to do something, to actually positively do something for us or to us. So if you have a right not to go hungry, that would in this way count as a positive right. Why? Because it means others have an obligation to do something. They have an obligation to feed you, to give you food. Since the obligation that they have is something more than just that they not do something, that they actually have to do something, that makes this a positive right. I'm not very happy with this distinction. I think it is one that ultimately is not very successful, and this is kind of the avenue that I was thinking of earlier when you asked about it. Why is it not successful? Well, it requires that we have a clear distinction in mind when we're thinking about distinguishing between doing something and not doing something. And it may seem like that's pretty clear. In philosophy, that's known as the distinction between doing and allowing. And how many trees have died in the project of trying to defend this distinction? It's something philosophers have beaten up, continue to beat up. It's very difficult to sustain this distinction, as it turns out. A lot of it depends on the way we describe things, where one and the same case described in different ways looks like it's a matter of doing something versus doing it another way. Describing it another way makes it look like it's not doing something. And if that's the case, if it ends up being sort of arbitrary, whether we describe what somebody's position in a given situation as being one of not doing something or doing something, then it turns out the distinction between positive and negative rights turns out to be sort of arbitrary. So that's one of the, and then we have a distinction that's not doing any work. So I think that line of argument is good. There are others that are not worth going into. I think ultimately this is not as good an analytical tool as we should have. It's very difficult to make it work, and I'm not sure in the end that it can be successful. So I don't want to use that tool. What do I want to do? I want to use a different tool. This is going to be a tool called a compossibility test. Again, a term only a philosopher could love. What's the idea behind compossibility? The idea behind compossibility is this, that rights are compossible when one person's right can be observed or respected without coming at the cost or the expense of observing or respecting that same right for someone else. Okay? Those rights are compossible, we could think, if we can simultaneously observe or respect both. Or put in terms of obligations, if the obligations that we have allow us to simultaneously deliver on both obligations at the same time. Those are compossible rights. So let me give you some examples here. So I can respect Hillary's right not to be battered. That's a negative right. So this is going to line up more or less with that distinction. I can respect Hillary's right not to be battered without in any way compromising Donald's right not to be battered. Right? I can simultaneously, and I am, in fact, right now, delivering on my obligation to Hillary not to battle her. At the same time, I'm delivering on my obligation not to batter Don. Right? Those do not come at the expense of each other. On the other hand, if I give food to Gary to satisfy an obligation that I have, corresponding to his right not to go hungry, I no longer have that food available to give to Jill. That means her right not to go hungry is one that I have to set aside. I have to ignore. I have to default on my obligation to deliver on her right not to go hungry. There's what economists think of as scarcity there. I can do one or I can do the other, but I can't do both. That means that right not to go hungry is not a compossible right. Why does that matter? Go back to equality. Here's where equality of authority comes in from this point. I'm going to put equality of authority to work here by claiming the idea that we have the equality of authority to obligate. Each of us, it has the standing equally to impose obligations on other people. That's exactly what equality of authority means. If I was right this morning, that idea is foundational in the liberal tradition, going back to Locke. It's one that we should adhere to. We should see ourselves as equally authoritative. Why does that matter? It's because rights that involve compossible obligations, that is, compossible rights, express equality of authority. So seeing others as bearing compossible rights is a way of seeing them as equally authoritative. We obligate each other equally in demanding, making the kinds of claims on others and obligating them in the way that compossible rights express. So Hillary and Donald can be equally authoritative with respect to their rights not to be battered, because they can be equally authoritative in laying on us obligations not to batter them. With non-compossible rights, that's not the case. With non-compossible rights, we have to make a choice. We have to accord the weights of some rights less than we do, some people's rights, less weight than we do the rights of others. We have to prioritize between the obligations that are being laid on us by different people. So they can't be equally authoritative, right? We can't think that Gary's right, we can't think that Jill's right not to go hungry is as weighty as Gary's if we're going to feed Gary. We can't think that Gary's right is equally authoritative as Jill's if we're going to feed Jill. We've got to choose between them. We can't treat them as equal. So the right to go hungry requires that we make a choice between the authority, that is the obligating capacity of Gary and Jill on us. And we have to choose between them. They can't obligate us equally. That means they cannot have equal authority. And that means that if we think we ought to recognize a right to go hungry, we have to give up the idea that we have equality of authority. We have to think that some of us are in position to make greater demands, greater moral demands to obligate more powerfully than other people. And that, I want to suggest, is a violation of that fundamental commitment to equality of authority. So non-compossible rights are, in this view, really problematic. If we're going to be equal in our authority to obligate others, we have to be equal in the obligations those rights impose. If we're going to be equal in those, that means we can recognize as legitimate only compossible rights. So what rights do we have if that's correct? That's a strong argument. I went through it really fast. We can explore its details. I do not for a moment want to suggest that it's all rolling downhill to defend all of that. But that's the view that I'm putting forward here as we're thinking about. So if all that is correct, what rights do we have? Well, perhaps this will come as not such a big shock. More or less, the list of rights that sort of are pretty time-honored, in the pretty time-honored list of the classical liberal rights. We certainly have rights. These would be claim rights to non-interference with our bodies and bodily integrity. That goes back to Locke and his thinking that we have rights to our bodies and labor. To labor, to acquire and hold property, and to obligate ourselves voluntarily, and by that I mean the right to contract, which is the overlooked sibling in this family. All of these are compossible rights. I don't know of any others that can go on this list as compossible that aren't on this list. So I think this is the right list of rights that deserve our recognition and allegiance as equally authoritative agents. Property. Why is property part of the story? Well, making property claims is a way of obligating other people. When Meg says, that's my camera, what she intends to be doing is saying, amongst other things, you are obligated to keep your hands off it. You wrong me if you make use of this camera without my permission. So a property right, claiming property rights, is a matter of demanding that others respect obligations that they have to us in virtue of it being their stuff. That's what property is. Right? Your property right to your stuff is a matter of others being obligated to leave it alone. Property rights, we could go on and on about the economic benefits of it, the moral benefits. This lines up with what John, I think, would say about property rights emerging through common law. The sort of moral perspective is that they provide us a sphere of operation in which we can act on our own judgment. We can act independently of the authority of others, right? The liberty rights that are involved in property. We do not have to ask others' permission to make use of the stuff that's ours. That's really important to us for a variety of both economic and moral reasons. We can respect their authority, but we do not have to ask it for the stuff that's ours. That's what allows for the development of civil society. So property rights are non-trivially important. A system of property rights, that is the network of norms that govern how we do that, how we understand that our obligations to each other involve the parts of the world that they do, how it is that we come to recognize that camera is in fact Meg's and not mine. That network of property rights is required in order to give us equal authorities. We have to have a system of norms that connects us up with stuff, that lets others know that we're connected up with stuff in the right way. So at the end of the day, we do care about our connection to the world. But that connection to the world comes in thinking about the relations that we have with one another and with the needs that we have to be related to the world. So a system of property rights is an expression of our equality of authorities having equal power. Markets obviously require property rights. Property rights begin with ourselves and our labor. They connect to the stuff in the world in ways that theories of rights will connect with. Markets and the whole idea of exchange is just a name for moving around the obligations, powers, claims, liberties, and so forth that we have in virtue of property. That's what we're doing in buying and selling. In one way, we're moving around stuff. More importantly, we're moving around our obligations. Right? One way to think about what goes on if Meg sells her camera is something about the camera. It's much more Meg's manipulation of the moral world in changing the relationship of obligations, liberties, and so forth between Meg and Nick and between both of them and all of us. That's really the big story about what markets are. Markets are complex moral relations that we have with each other in virtue of what we want to do with the world. What about contract? As I said, contract is the overlooked sibling in this story. I think we're inclined to overlook contract and its significance. In modern political philosophical traditions, starting with Rawls, contract is almost entirely eviscerated. In fact, there is no right to contract in Rawls' theory of justice. There's no fundamental right to contract. I think that's a moral embarrassment, because contract really matters. Contract really matters morally. Why? Contract, the right to contract, is an expression of our moral powers to change our obligations and the obligations of others. It's a fundamental kind of moral capacity that we have as grown-ups. We as grown-ups have the capacity to obligate ourselves, for starters. Right? If I make a deal with you to pick you up at the airport, right? Prior to making that deal, I have no obligation to pick you up at the airport. After I make that deal, I do have an obligation. So I'm binding myself. I'm doing something to my moral world as a grown-up with you. I'm making myself accountable to you. Prior to making that deal, you have nothing to say if I fail to pick you up. After I make that deal, you absolutely are entitled to complain to me, about me, and to demand that I do something in virtue of having defaulted on my obligation. So when I make a deal, when I make a promise or a contract, I'm binding myself. And your recognition of my power to do that is your recognition of me as a moral being, as a grown-up and not a child. And various things that we do now in society and policy vitiate that recognition in people. It's a matter of respect for people to see them as being able to obligate themselves in that way. An example here, there are lots of things that we could say about minimum wage laws. I'm sure the economists in the room would have lots of things to say about minimum wages. My comment as a moral philosopher is that minimum wage laws are fundamentally disrespectful. Fundamentally disrespectful to those whom they are supposed to protect. Because they deny those people the right to obligate themselves in ways that the minimum wage laws forbid. If I pass a minimum wage law, I'm saying, sorry, you no longer have the capacity to bind yourself to work for $10 an hour. I deprive you of the authority over your own labor that right expresses. And when I do that, I treat you as a child. I never going to get this out. You know what I mean. I treat you like a child. I'll stick with that. Right? It's a lack of respect for you. And say what you like about the economic benefits. I think it's horrific that we can walk past the idea that some people think they can speak for other people with respect to the obligations they can take on for their own bodies and labor. Hardly anything is more disrespectful. That point about minimum wage is systematically lost, and I think classical liberals and libertarians should be on that like green on grass. Because we have a moral complaint about those kinds of policies. That's far from the only one. Drug prohibition, same thing. Right? A fundamental matter of disrespect for people's authority over their own bodies and labor, their capacities to obligate themselves to others. That's something that grown-ups do, and it's respect for other people as grown-ups, as moral agents, that require that we accept that authority that they have. We don't get to supervene or superimpose our own on theirs just because we think we can. Okay, I will stop there. And am I doing the time? Yes,
We've got quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I'll stop there. We could talk about stuff that's on the list. We can talk about some of the distinctions that I raised, or we can talk about anything else that you're inclined to think about. Jen.
Well, if you don't mind, there are a bunch of students here who are studying environmental ethics, and we just read an argument against animal rights, suggesting animals can't have rights because rights have to be positive. You know, so we've just read, well, rights, for them to make any sense, they have to be positive, and we certainly could not, provide animals, all animals, what they need for their welfare.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you would mind talking about animal rights or children's rights.
Yeah. Okay. Great questions. I have very different answers to the two of those. That might not surprise you. So I'm very sympathetic with the idea that animals don't have rights. Why is that? And it maybe it, so I don't want to call on the positive negative right story to do that. I want to do that by calling on this framework that I've just been making a case for. The rights are tied up with our recognition of each other as morally authoritative equals, of our having equality of authority. Right? So my thinking about rights sees rights as a product of this network of relations that we're in as moral equals, as equally capable of binding others and recognizing the binding that others are capable of with us. That's what you and I can do that, right? I cannot do that with Fido. Right? I cannot do that with my dog. I can love my dog, but I can't respect him as a moral equal precisely because my dog is completely incapable of recognizing me in that way. We cannot have a reciprocal relationship. And I think that kind of reciprocity and the equality that it's underwriting it, because I think that's necessary for rights, that leaves animals out of the equation. So I'm comfortable with writing animal rights off, which is not, I think we have obligations to animals, but it's not because they have rights against us. So I think we can have obligations without rights, but no rights without obligations. So I may have lots of obligations to my dog, but they don't follow because he has rights. They follow for other reasons. That raises the obvious question about children. right? Because, you know, children are sort of in the same boat as dogs. Children are not capable of standing up for themselves. They're not capable of doing lots of things. The difference between children and animals is that children will at one point come to occupy that status as a moral equal. And I think, and we all know this is a feature of human life, that human beings start off, right, as creatures that don't have those necessary powers and capacities. Then for most of their life they do. Sometimes at the end they lose them again. And I think it makes sense to think hard about what we want to say about those phases of life. In some ways, the end of life phases are harder because we don't know what's going to happen there. With children, we do know that they are going to turn into people who are capable of that kind of moral equality. And I think the right way to think about children is to think of ourselves, especially parents in particular, as having a sort of agency, standing in a sort of, hang on just a second, having a sort of agency relation or trustee type relation, to where parents are stewards of the rights that the fully grown children will have. This is the way that, at least that I thought about this with my children. I thought that the obligations that I had to them in virtue of the rights that they as adults will have against me governed what I could do as their trustee when they were younger. So I do want to say they have rights, but it's in virtue of sort of a continuity that they will have across the span of their life rather than where they're at this particular moment in time. I've seen a couple of follow-ups, so let me follow up, and then if you have questions, welcome to come back. Yes, sir?
Applying our logic about the severe deliberation.
Yeah, I think people with us, so it has to be pretty severe because the threshold here is something like the capacity to recognize this network of obligations that human beings are in. And I think that doesn't require anything like normal intelligence. But grant that, wherever you set that threshold, there are human beings that are going to fall below it. And so maybe this is a bullet I have to bite, maybe not. I think those people do not have rights against us. Again, as with the animal case, I think that doesn't mean that we don't have obligations to them. And in fact, the obligations to them might be quite stringent. And precisely because they don't have rights, because they're sort of out of the moral universe that we're, or out of the reciprocity relations that I'm focusing on, they can't relieve us from those obligations. So I think we have obligations to them, but if they are sort of unrecoverably out of the network of reciprocal relations that we're in, I don't think they have rights. So, sorry, go ahead.
Wouldn't that directly lead towards things like selective breeding to breed out genetics?
It would depend on what kinds of obligations we have. And it might be that one obligation that I have to you is not to advocate for genetic breeding, even because you're not severely mentally defective. And it might be that we stand in a relationship with each other, that we ought not to be imposing controls on breeding programs and stuff like that. So I'm inclined to think that I am inclined to think there's something unjust about selective breeding programs. And I'm inclined to think that we can cash that out pretty effectively by thinking about the kinds of authority that we have over one another as moral equals with others within the normal range of intellectual capabilities that people have, without going and thinking about the rights of those who are defective. Might invoke the obligations that we have to those who are defective, but I don't think we have to have recourse to rights. There was a question, yeah.
Mine was kind of the same question, but just the answer that you've given to it kind of worries me that there has to be a certain level of intellectual ability for there to be rights. Like, at what point do you set the bar? I mean, if you set the bar way too high, only as few have rights.
Yeah, so I think the bar is capacity for reciprocity. Where that turns out in practice is a hard question. Notice that we don't get out of that question no matter what we do. Right, so it's not like I'm taking on a burden here that we don't have in life already. The law already has to do that, right? The issue of discriminating between legal competence and legal incompetence, that is, if not identical with that question, at least it's structurally isomorphic to it. So we know that there are people on the healthy side of the line where we can think for ourselves, make those judgments, and we know that there are people on the other side where they cannot. Right? There's human beings that lack those capacities, And we know that which side of the line a given individual falls on really matters. It's really important. And we know that there's going to be hard cases where the risk of getting it wrong is high and costly. And so, and my view is vulnerable to that objection. But I don't know of any view that's not. It may or may not be taking on board higher costs. I don't think it is than we already face with making determinations of that kind. Certainly, I think the line that you're pushing, or the line that you guys are worried about here, argues in favor of erring on the generous side of seeing those that are in, that we have some doubt about as being rights holders. I think we should do that. So, but that's not a concrete recommendation. That's just a way of recognizing that something really significant. So by the way, it's difficult to take that line and not take seriously things like minimum wage laws, right? To the extent that you think, wait a second, you really wronged somebody by depriving them of the authority that seeing them as a rights holder has, right? That's, I think, a sound intuition. And then to turn around and say, yeah, but we can deprive them of the authority over their own bodies and labor in ways that minimum wage laws involves. That's completely incompatible. Right? So I think it's really hard to take that kind of care for those who are in compromised intellectual positions and not worry similarly about the cavalier way in which we think that we can legislate for those who just happen to not qualify for jobs above whatever the minimum wage is. There were other, so I'll come back to you. I thought there were, anybody else? In that case, back to you.
So I guess what I'm kind of trying to understand what you're saying is that, like, if, I know there have been people that had issues with their dogs being shot by police officers because the dog, or the police officers were going onto their property, and the dog, you know, there's the debate about whether the dog had the right to attack, or kind of applying that to people with severe mental retardation. Does that mean that if they don't have rights because they can't consciously stand up for themselves, that same principle applies, that a police officer could, if some kind of threat were given to them, like someone who has severe mental retardation, since they're scared and they don't know who to discern between safe and not safe, they might attack a police officer, but they would have no right to defend themselves if the police officer would shoot them.
So I guess there's a nest of ideas there. Certainly we can imagine, right, so the worry starts with the idea that there's these shootings that we come to feel are unjustified, of pets and dogs and so forth. And the worry is, however bad it is when a dog gets shot for that kind of reason, surely it's worse if a human being gets shot on a similar thin basis. And if you have a human being whose intelligence is maybe not that much better than a dog's, doesn't that person deserve even more protection than the dog does? So working through a couple things there. So number one, I don't think it's the case, even though I say dogs don't have rights. I think if it's my dog and my property, I have rights. And I have rights that the cop not shoot the dog. So the cop is wrongdoing. The cop is absolutely wronging somebody. It's not the dog. He's wronging me. He's harming the dog. He's wronging me. Because it's my rights, because he's my dog and it's my property. So I think nothing that I say about giving up on animal rights undermines both the idea that wrong is being done here and the kind of analytical tools to get right what needs fixing. What needs fixing is the world in which the cop thinks he's entitled to do that on my property. That's a problem. It's a problem with disrespect for my property rights and my property. That doesn't solve the problem for now the person with limited mental capacities. But I think if we think somebody is in that kind of state where they're incapable of making those kinds of judgments, there's a burden of stewardship. Who has that burden? I don't know. That would be the same with children, right? With my children, not only am I in a position, or was I in a position when they were younger, to make those determinations for them, I also had a responsibility to keep them out of those conditions, right? I have a responsibility to keep them from, pointing toy guns at cops, especially when they're in Cleveland. So there's a burden there. I don't know that thinking and again, there's a problem with the rights of children. Maybe this would be the worry. My story works out okay that if a cop shoots a child, there's a rights violation. There's not on the story that I'm telling where they shoot someone who's sufficiently mentally defective that they can't apprehend the kind of condition that they're in. Maybe that's a problem. I confess that, I mean, I have no problem about the resources to make it so the cop better not be shooting people like that. And I don't think that I need rights to do it, but you might think, but you've lost this extra moral, what you've lost, I can say that it's wrong for the cop to shoot a person in those conditions. What I can't say is that the cop has wronged that person, in the same way that the cop has not wronged the dog. And you might think that makes all the difference.
So what about in regards to something like abortion? Before a child's born, you
Yeah.
can't usually tell if it's been food retarded or not.
Right.
So would that mean that women don't have rights to over their bodies, or
Yeah.
that the child has inherent rights over the mother?
So I don't think this view that I've just given you, I don't think it does really, if it does anything to help out with thinking about abortion, I don't know what it is. Abortion is, I think, the hardest, I don't know of any question that's hard. And libertarians obviously are split on abortion, just like everybody else is. Why? Because it comes down to, one way of thinking about why is it comes down to thinking about the interesting and absolutely unique moral position that a fetus occupies as being a human being, but also needing the body of another human being until gestation in order to survive. And that changes the moral framework of everything that we think about it, right? After viability, nobody is in that same position with another person. So abortion is a one-off kind of question in a distinctive way. And if you think that so this goes back to the question of why it is that we have the rights that we have. If you have a view, for example, on which being born of human or carrying human DNA is what vests you with the rights that you have, then you're going to be inclined to think that fetus is in exactly the same position as being trusteeship, right, as an infant. And so you're going to have a strongly anti-abortion position. If you think, no, that's not right, there's some other story about how it is that we come to bear rights, and fetuses at various stages don't have that, then you're going to be much more pro-choice. And so the decisions that you make on that different theory about how it is that we come to have the rights that we have is going to wash through what I've said in a way which sort of leaves me not having settled very much of anything. So I don't think what I've said here sheds very much light on how to think about that more. It doesn't say when it is, what I've said doesn't say when it is that people have the standing that it's the problematic issue thinking about abortion. I don't have a way to improve that discussion. Peter?
So, Hayek once said that the economist that only understands economics is very dangerous. Right? And Peter Bettke has a corollary to that he says, except for moral philosophers who don't know economics. Right? And so I want to go back to your idea of, I know you, and I really actually like the idea of saying that positive and negative rights are not actually a really good way to do this. But there's still, as you point out, right, it's that whole idea of scarcity.
Yeah.
And that lack of understanding on the part of philosophers to understand that scarcity is in fact a real thing, that you can't have positive rights for everybody because it's not possible, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say in that regard in terms of philosophers need to better understand economics, not just the aspects of rights in terms of the way that we do, but just simpler aspects of this?
Well, number one, the phenomenon of economic ignorance amongst philosophers, sadly, and in particular in political philosophers, is appalling and abhorrent and indefensible. So in general, the terrain of political philosophy would be vastly improved if more than just a smattering of people had gotten the basics in economic thinking. So that's absolutely, and that's a sort of gross condemnation of big swaths of political philosophy. And now as to on this particular issue, the best philosophers I know that would be pushing back on this would push back in this way. They push back in a couple ways. They would say we grant scarcity. But one way to get off the hook here is to break the link that I was arguing for, the correlativity link between the right and obligation. And they'll say, right, what we should do is recognize sometimes scarcity bars some individuals from being obligated. But people can have rights even if we can't allocate the obligations because of problems with scarcity. So rights and obligations often travel together, but we can intelligibly talk about rights even when there's no correlative obligation. And that's, for example, the way that people usually talk about human rights. They'll read the Declaration of Human Rights, you know, the UN Declaration. They'll read that as cast in that kind of language where we can say anything we like about rights because it's not really tethered to simultaneously making claims about obligations precisely because of scarcity. So my worry about when you do that is, number one, it just turns out that the language has come untethered from the real world. And it turns out to be very, very difficult what you're saying when you say someone has a right, more than saying that it's a right, everyone has a right to adequate nutrition. Presumably that you're saying something more than it would be really good if everyone had enough to eat, right? Which is true. But saying that people have a right is supposed to be doing something more. And in the tighter analytic framework where there's correlativity at work, we know what more there is. That is, we're in the business of allocating obligations. When you say there's a right, you think there's people that owe to deliver in some form or another on that. You cut that link, and now it's not clear what you're saying. So I think they'll try to resist in that way. They'll cut bait on correlativity under the pressure of scarcity rather than saying, oh yeah, you're right, I should just back off. That's the way they're going to get out from under that. But at that point now you have a debate about how robust the tightly correlative understanding of rights is. And there the law is way ahead of ordinary discourse. The law is pretty tight. So it's only when you have this sort of hand-wavy stuff like UN declarations of universal rights that you get people saying people have all kinds of rights without thinking what that would actually mean for obligations on them. The other place that I didn't mention this with respect to positive and negative rights, actually it's sort of compounding of the original error, is they'll say, well look, what does it mean to say that Meg has a right to this camera? Well, part of what it means is that if I try to take the camera, she has a right to others intervening. She has a right that somebody like the police coming in and protecting her property. Well, of course, her right to have others intervene is a positive right, right? That means that others have an obligation to do something. So they'll say, so don't you see, her negative right really involves all these positive rights. I think it's sort of systematically a bad way of thinking about it, but if you take the positive-negative right framework as being bedrock, it's really hard to sort of get out. You just, wherever you push in one direction, you find you're stuck with something else. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, yeah, I
Did I? How lucky. Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Yes, ma'am?
Just to reword it, like the positive right being kind of like something you're entitled to versus liberty being something you're free from.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of.
You know, at a kind of I don't know, intuitive level, that makes sense. But there's been a lot of philosophers that have put a lot of pressure on this. And what has become apparent over time is that clever philosophers, however intuitively you think that should work, they'll find a way to give you cases that are going to bust your framework out. Right? So, and some of that is a matter of verbal gymnastics. Others, I think the really good arguments are ones that call on our ordinary linguistic intuitions. It's the same thing for whether you're doing something or allowing it to happen, right? But one of the cases there, one of the thought experiments that was really significant there is imagine that, you know, I don't know, you have a rich uncle, you know that you're going to inherit a ton of money from your rich uncle. You happen to be walking by the bathroom of your uncle's house one time when he's about to take a bath. You notice that he slips and falls as he's getting in the tub. He's unconscious. He's underwater. And you stand there and watch your uncle drown. Are you doing something to him? Are you killing your uncle when you could easily intervene and save his life? Or are you just allowing him to drown? And it turns out, the argument is, our intuitions about that depend on whether or not people's intuitions about that depend on whether or not they think people are obligated to do something. If people think you're obligated to intervene and save your uncle's life, then they're going to say you're doing something. You're killing your uncle. If they think you don't have that obligation, they'll say, you're just allowing him to die. So the judgments that we make about rights and obligations actually sort of seem to precede whether or not we think people are doing something, actively doing something, or just allowing. That's just one example, but that's kind of typical. Yeah, Kelly?
So what are the grounds for obligations to animals that you alluded to economic rights? Like you said, we might have some obligations
Yeah.
to animals, but they don't have rights. So what would some of those obligations be ground on?
So part of it certainly is on the fact that we know animals are sentient, and I think the fact that other creatures are capable of feeling pain, pleasure and pain, is a basis for seeing ourselves as obligated to them. Number two, I think we take on obligations to animals when we take them in as pets or otherwise domesticate them. Right? We're depriving them of the conditions in which they'd normally be capable of feeding themselves and caring for themselves. I think we take on a positive burden of care. So I think there can be, and third, I think, I don't know that I would have said this before I had a dog. I didn't have a dog when I was a kid, but I did and I do. Had a Australian cattle dog who lived to 16, and to this day I love that dog down to the marrow of my bones. And it was because of my love for that dog, that particular dog. You know, he was my pet. He was sent in, yeah, that's true, but it's also because he was Max. And because I had history with him, I had history of interaction with him, he knew me, he trusted me, right? So there's lots of things, those are pretty rich. Relationships with those kinds, with animals in that way, are incredibly rich, right? And I don't feel a need to go on and say, oh yeah, and he had rights, because who cares whether he had rights? This relationship is a morally saturated relationship already. And we know that we can have relationships like that with lots of animals. You know, maybe not with toads or squirrels, with dogs and cats and horses, right? Those kinds of animals that very often generate these kinds of concerns. We don't have any trouble recognizing the richness of the frameworks in which that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the distinction between someone who's extremely mentally disabled and an animal. And it seems to me that an obligation you would have towards someone with extreme mental disabilities might be grounded on the fact that as a human being, they should have had the potential to have reciprocal norms with individuals, and it's only a matter of, unfortunate luck, and really a great tragedy that they weren't able to, possibly the greatest tragedy that could befall a person, or any being for that matter, to not be able to engage in those reciprocal relationships. So that seems to me like a stronger obligation than would be for an animal that was never capable of achieving that potential. And so there is a distinction between an obligation. You have more of an obligation, in my view, to a disabled person to an animal because of that missed potential.
Dave Schmitz has a great paper that's now a little bit old from the 90s called Are All Species Equal? And one of the things, and his target in that is Peter Singer's. Right? Peter Singer is sort of a famous animal. He's not an animal rights activist because he doesn't believe in rights, but he does believe in animal interests, and he argues in some positions for the sort of moral seriousness with which we should take animal claims on us in virtue of their capacity to suffer pain and experience pleasure. But Schmitz's target in that paper is the idea that there would just be one basis on which individuals, animals, or plants, or human beings would acquire the standing to be morally considerable. And his argument is, right, you're going to impoverish any view if you don't recognize that there are multiple things that go on, right? And his particular animal, or his one example that he has is, I think if I have this right, he's comparing mosquitoes and cows. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he also compares cows and carrots, which are both living things. But he also talks about mosquitoes and cows, right? They're both animals. But if you think that you owe the same thing to a mosquito that you do to a cow, there's some way in which you're missing something about cows. We do owe cows more than, or even more than mice. We owe cows more than we owe mice. Why is that? Well, there's lots of bases on which we might come to have obligations to cows, not so many with mice. It really simplifies the world. It sort of makes it flat and two-dimensional to imagine it's just one thing.
Sorry, so this is a little, I've never been able to get this question out there properly, but so let's say that theoretically it's possible to have a species that is a sort of agency greater than a human.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a whole other dimension of
Angels or
reciprocity
something.
that we aren't capable of achieving. Let's say
Yeah.
potential for that. Then under your view, or this, I guess this machine, this view of Schmidt's, you know, those alien creatures would not know us the same. They would have different rights, or, you know what I'm saying? They would
Yeah.
we would be subservient under them. So,
It's hard for me to answer that question,
Yeah.
and not just because it's speculative, but here it sort of goes for me to philosophical methodology. I think that, and this is a moral analog maybe to some of what Hassens has been saying about the law. I think we have the attitudes that we do because of the history that we have in evolving forms of life in which we live with each other. And I think if your beings came along, it would be really not very wise for us to decide ex ante what those relations could be, and instead we should allow them to emerge from those relationships. If we're capable of entering into cooperative relationships with them, if we're capable of sharing goals the way that we are with other human beings, it seems very plausible to me, and recognizing each other as having those kinds of capacities, at the very least we would have the kind of obligations to them that we do to our moral equals on earth. I'm not sure in what way they could be moral equals, but I would think, let's not pronounce in advance, let's live within this world and see what emerges as good ways to relate to them. So that's a non-a priori, very kind of Aristotelian way of answering that question. Yes, sir.
Well, that's a really hard question. I want to go back about 5 minutes.
So hard
Easier
to
to-
deduct it. in case you
Yeah,
didn't
so when you were talking about the positive rights philosopher who was put the case about your rich uncle is in the tub,
know. Yeah.
so they thought about an example where the obligation of you is trivially small. All you have to do is reach down there
Yeah.
and lift them up. But I think that's a really easy one to dismiss, because it would just be simple to say, well, listen, don't let the uncle be in the tub. Let's put the uncle 100 feet offshore. Now the uncle is drowning.
Shark-infested water.
Right, and so now there is some risk
Yeah.
to me, or some burden to
Right.
me, and it would simply be a debate about, well, how many feet out do they have to go?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think even that positive rights philosopher would eventually have to yield to this idea that, I'm burdened now.
Well, I sort of ran together two lines of thought there. The challenge, so that example was targeted at the robustness of the distinction between doing and allowing.
Okay.
And that's a whole other literature, sort of in action theory, and understanding when it is that we're doing something as opposed to allowing something to occur, that has a life of its own. And that case is targeted at trying to undermine our confidence that we really have robust intuitions as to when somebody's doing something and when it's allowing. Now, the positive rights people will seize on those conclusions amongst others in making their cases. But they won't necessarily try to use that particular example as something about positive or negative rights. But if the positive and negative rights distinction depends on whether or not we're doing or allowing something, then it stands or falls with that distinction. So if that kind of case undermines it, then it gets really difficult. As I said, I think the positive negative rights distinction is okay as a first approximation. We sort of know what we're talking about, but it doesn't have the precision or robustness that I think we need. And I think the distinction between possibility and incompossibility does. So that's why I'm in favor of using that as an analytical tool instead. Other questions? Okay, well, I thank you for your time.